Dr. Kirkpatrick, thank you so much for making the time. Appreciate it. Like the focus of this conversation to be on those three well-known UAP videos that have been released, Gimbal, GoFast, and FLIR One. But that being said, after I reached out to you and things move fast in this space, we learned that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer reintroduced the UAP Disclosure Act as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. I'd love to maybe pick your brain and get some of your feedback. So I'm going to put myself in the position of an average citizen in your former office, the All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, put out an extensive report that, from my read, categorically denied the existence of these alleged, rumored UFO, UAP retrieval and reverse engineering efforts. Fast forward 3 or 4 months to just this last weekend, and the Senate Majority Leader has reintroduced legislation that, if you read, and I can share my screen, I'll maybe add a few key elements, that if you read through the lines and between the lines, it almost says that elements of the U.S. government have hidden this material, and that legacy programs that are defined and non-human intelligence is defined and makes almost 24 appearances. So how am I as an average observer supposed to balance what, the findings of your office with this language? And I'll quickly, if you don't mind, I'll just quickly share my screen to kind of highlight a couple of those key segments. Let me know if that's coming through for you.
Yep, that's fine.
So the question then is, the Senate Majority Leader, this is generally a cautious politician is put, set on the Senate floor, citing multiple credible sources that information has illegally been withheld from Congress. That's a pretty stunning allegation from the most powerful senator in Congress. Your thoughts, Dr. Kirkpatrick, on the reintroduction of this following AARO's report?
Well, look, let me be clear. We found no evidence of any of these allegations, none. And I had access to everything there was to have access to. I went up and briefed and testified just as recently as a couple of months ago with the SAPCO director and the CAPCO director from ODNI. And all of us have gone through everything that we have, everything that witnesses have come forward and said, hey, this is this hidden program. And it turns out none of them are those hidden programs. None of them. All of them have turned out to be other things that have nothing to do with extraterrestrials, reverse engineering, and all of them have been reported to Congress.
Right.
And what you will also find is in that extensive Volume 1 historical report, which we conducted under my directorship, you will find a section in there that talks about some of the people involved in these allegations. Those people have all been working this problem, if you want to call it a problem, for 20 years. And most of them are associated with some of the original work done under Bigelow and the former past Senator Harry Reid,
Right.
and are in a position to benefit from this type of language, which then drives for further investment by Congress and further investigation being directed at AARO, at the Pentagon, at the IC to go and look at this.
Right.
So from this perspective, Senator Schumer is listening to his staffers. His staffers are listening to these people.
Yeah.
And when they come forward and they say, hey, we have credible people. Okay,
Yeah.
You have credible people. I have credible people. The government is full of credible people. All of them are experienced in what their role is in government. They do not necessarily know when they come across something from another part of the government, especially when we're talking about the United States' ability to maintain technological superiority against adversaries and the research and development that goes into that. Some of these credible people don't have any idea about what they're looking at. In fact, I know all of these credible people, and there's not a one of them that's a real physicist.
Yeah.
So I have a hard time explaining that to the general public because they want to believe, hey, there's some guy claims he's got, information about this. That's true. But none of them have presented any evidence.
Yeah.
Nothing that is actionable, nothing that can go on. So all of this legislation is all coming from people saying they've seen something or saying they know about something
Right.
or saying that they saw something,
Right.
but not one of them have provided any actual evidence. And all of the evidence that we investigated and tracked down and pulled out of archives and declassified,
Right.
everything from the DHS program that we uncovered and declassified to the most recent report that finally got published on the material that had been alleged to come from one of these sites. All of those things we conducted and finished before I retired, and none of them turned up anything that was positive. None of them turned up anything that had any credibility as far as this is an extraterrestrial reverse engineering program. So I think this legislation, it's great. Okay, you want to put a law out there that says you have to turn over all of this, this biological evidence of non-human intelligence and reverse engineering programs, and everybody is going to scratch their heads and go, what? What is it you want to hear about? Where is this that you think this is? I told everybody, in fact, I think I said this in one of my first testimonies last year. Nothing would have made me happier than to be able to find evidence of this, right? That would have been fantastic, but it doesn't exist.
Right.
And nobody wants to believe that it doesn't exist. And nobody wants to believe that these people have any other motive other than we know what we're looking at. And it must be extraterrestrial.
Would it be fair for me to say, just on its face, that there's a disconnect? If Schumer in rounds and all these other co-sponsors introduced it last year, and the AARO report comes out, says there's nothing here, we've interviewed sources A, B, C, D, blah blah blah, blah whatever it is, and I'm sure there's more in the classified report. If this legislation were not reintroduced, I'd say, okay, great. They trust AARO, they bought it. It seems to me on its face that there is a disconnect between what AARO put out. Is that a fair characterization, or right? Does that make sense?
Last year, when we convinced Congress last year not to go down that road, because in that Schumer amendment last year was additional legislation, if you recall, that directed NARA to stand up, and turn over all of its, but they had already given that responsibility to AARO.
Okay.
So it was duplicative in that they were now directing two different organizations to do the same.
I see.
And we told them that's ridiculous. We have already started working with NARA. At that time, we'd already uncovered more documents that NARA had put out there. NARA had already set up their web portal, linked it to our web page. We'd already gone down this road. There was no need for additional legislation. And people tend to forget that, right? They complain about, the inefficiency of government. And here we are, the government, trying to say, you're being inefficient, stop doing that. Right. And everybody gets ticked off. And that's what happened. Is now they got upset and they're like, well, we're going to just reintroduce it. And why? Because you got the people like, Tim Burchett and Luna, who are all on the House side, who are making all of this noise. None of them are actually cleared to any of the SAP programs that we've uncovered that have nothing to do with extraterrestrial activities. And they're not going to be, because they won't go to their internal Senate and House
Right.
Intel and defense oversight committees and ask for access and be given access because they don't have a need to know. But that's Congress's problem to deal with, not the departments and the ICs.
Can I follow
And
up
so,
on, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, so here we are again, right? Where they're gonna introduce this law. Maybe it gets through the NDAA, maybe it won't. Or it'll be some form of it, I'm sure. And they're telling the commercial industry they have to turn over all of this stuff. Well, the commercial industry, and I talk to all of the commercial industry, and they're scratching their heads and they don't know what they're talking about. And that's where this last report with this piece of material comes in. And this is why we keep trying to put all this stuff out here. These are all the pieces of the puzzle. That piece of material that was alleged to be a piece of UAP material from a crash in 1947, no chain of custody, but let's put that aside for a minute. So that is the piece of material that was at one point given to a commercial partner, and they were asked to see if they could figure out what it was on the basis of the belief that it was a extraterrestrial UAP. And those guys took a look at it and said, yeah, we can't, there's nothing here. We don't know what this is. Looks like a piece of regular material.
Yeah.
And they couldn't recreate it. And the reason they couldn't recreate it is because the material was generated from chemistry that was done back in the 50s that we don't do anymore. But that's not the story that gets propagated into the conspiracy world, which is all they took was we can't recreate it.
Yeah.
Well, therefore, it must be extraterrestrial because we don't have the technology.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's not what that means. It means that we gave up that technology decades ago because it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so the analysis report that finally came out, right, talks about, look, this is a piece of standard magnesium-based, material. It was the same chemistry that was used in a number of Air Force programs of missiles and missile testing back in the day. That's what it likely is. Are we ever going to prove it 100%? Of course not, because we don't have the chemistry anymore to prove it. But what we did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, is it's not extraterrestrial because the ratio of the isotopes don't match. It's definitely terrestrial, and it's definitely a rolled composite. So that's the kind of thought train that gets propagated into the public,
Yep.
that then comes around, boomerangs around up through Congress,
Yep.
and gets turned into, well, there must be something there.
Yep. Got it. Can I follow up quickly on one thing? And I just apologize just because time is tight and I want to
That's all
be
right. Go ahead.
respectful of your time. And maybe I misunderstood, but if I heard you correctly, did you say that you or AARO pushed back on the Schumer rounds amendment when it was proposed last year? That seems to be a big mystery as to how it was, shall we say, watered down. Other people say gutted.
So let's be clear about how the process works in the United
Yes.
States government. Every year, the NDAA is put together by proposals from both the Senate and the House side.
Correct.
Okay. Those proposals are socialized with the department.
Right.
The department then gets an opportunity to write a reclama that goes back to the Hill that says, hey, this is not a good idea for these reasons. Or this would be better if it was written this way. Or, yeah, we just can't really support this because of these resource constraints or whatever the case may be. And that is true for every piece of the NDAA.
Right.
It gets farmed back to us and we get to, or the department, to go look at that. As AARO, the pieces of legislation that were written about AARO come to us and we are allowed to write our thoughts and disclaimers. And
Sure.
so we wrote exactly that. Look, this is duplicative of language you gave us in 22. Let us finish the thing that you told us to do the first time before
Yes.
you write additional legislation.
Got it. Did that,
And
if I
so,
may, yep,
yeah,
go ahead. Did,
No,
did
no,
that
but
apply? Did Arrow's, let's say, commentary on this reclama, did that extend to the review board? Is that what you see as duplicative? I'm sure you're, sorry, let me provide background. I'm sure you're tracking the proposed supposedly
yes.
blue ribbon panel, right? Was that
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that
It's the
Arrow opined
same.
upon?
It's the same. Exactly. We said the same thing on that.
Okay,
We're like,
got
why
it.
do you need that? Look, Arrow, look, everybody needs to understand, Arrow is a congressional creation.
Yes, yes,
Arrow is there to answer the congressional direction to go do these missions.
right.
They were given authorities and resources to go do that mission.
Yep,
And and what's happening is Congress is getting fed, continual uh, misinformation about what is happening.
right.
And as a consequence, they're not waiting. One, they're not waiting for the mission to get executed. It does
Yep,
take time to go
yep,
through all of that.
yep.
Two, many of those senators have never even asked for an update.
Yeah.
By the time I had retired, I mean Schumer had never asked for a briefing. He never got anything from Arrow directly.
Yeah.
So they never asked the questions. Nobody had an opportunity to answer them. And
Yeah.
now they're going to go, well, let's just write more legislation.
Right.
Well,
Right.
that is wasteful,
Right.
right? Because now you're whipsawing the department and the
Right.
IC and the rest of the interagency to try
Yeah.
and convincingly answer them on there is nothing there. There has nothing been turned over.
Yeah.
And you can't prove a negative.
Right. Right.
So, this is not going to end.
Can I maybe just slightly play devil's advocate and I hear everything you're saying and I'd like to maybe dive into that just for and I want to also get to the really what we want to talk about, but just to play devil's advocate from my read, the UAP topic has been deeply stigmatized over many decades, right? The giggle factor, right? People reflexively, I never thought I'd be sitting here talking to you. This is the last thing I ever thought I'd be thinking about. And generally, I view the individuals, Rubio as vice chairman of Senate Intel, Gillibrand, Schumer certainly, as generally cautious politicians. And from my read, it would take a hell of, and this is just me, it would take quite a bit of the evidentiary threshold, I feel like should be fairly high for these individuals to stick out their necks. And that includes Harry Reid and Senator McCain was interested in this, and Lieberman was part of the whole OSAP, right, or the DHS attempted reinvention. So for them to put 64 pages of this highly detailed, I feel like there should be some kind of an evidentiary threshold. Is that a fair opinion for some Americans to have?
That's
It's,
absolutely that is a critical thing. And that is what I walked into them every time
yeah,
with.
okay,
You need to have evidence, and they don't have any, and we didn't find any. But that's not scratching the itch because you have these highly credible people who keep coming forward.
yeah,
Some of these highly credible people still wouldn't come in to talk to us
right, right,
because they know that our threshold, certainly my threshold for evidence,
right,
was scientifically based, logically based, critical thinking based, rational,
right,
and we could prove it.
right.
If you can't prove it, it's just hearsay. And
Yes,
everybody that we talked to, it was all turned into circular reporting. Somebody came in and said, I know that this happened because somebody else told me. And then you go talk to that person. Like, we know that happened because somebody else told them.
right. When I read through the historical report, and there's a section in the unclassed version that outlines the various sources and what they've alleged in general terms. And as I go through it, I feel like I can. You don't have to. Obviously, this is a confidentiality, but I feel like the bulk of those individuals are publicly known. Your Eric Davises, your Hal Puthoffs, your Lou Elizondos, your I think Michael Herrera. There's other individuals that have been out. You don't have to. I don't want to break confidentiality. It sounds like those are publicly known figures, and the individuals. If I'm understanding you correctly, and is it fair to say that the individuals leading this effort are all publicly known? Is that fair?
I would say the bulk of them are. We at that time, I think for volume one, we had interviewed and or questioned 40 some odd people.
Okay, that's a lot.
Um, that's a lot. And looked at who was saying what to whom and how was all this mapped out and who worked where and
Yeah,
who did what and how did this all come about. Um, some of them are obviously very vocal in the public domain. Some
right.
of them are not as vocal in the public domain,
Yeah, yeah,
but they're all linked.
yeah. Okay.
Um,
If I
and
may, I'll just quickly
I,
share. Yeah.
I can give you 15 more minutes after that.
Okay, I really appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Let me just quickly share with you something that an individual, a Senate source that was involved in this topic shared with me, and I put this out publicly. So I'd love to just get your response on this because I'm trying to get to the public figures versus the private figures. Senator Rubio has said some pretty stunning comments that seem to take you off guard in the signal exchange. But here's what a Senate source told me, and it said most of these individuals are completely unknown. Um, and then you can read on here, right? Questions about motivations when people go public. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but this is, and you don't have to trust me, but this is a source that I trust and I know is involved in this topic.
I've had this conversation with Rubio and Warner and
Yeah,
Gillibrand and
yeah,
others. Um, Let me differentiate. Like 40 some odd people, most of those are not public.
right.
But the core of the people that have been really, advocating and have their fingers in a number of these pies are all connected and are many of them are public. So
Yeah,
that there's really two camps. But the camp that's mostly public is getting a lot of their information right from these other folks, but these other folks have no evidence. And all of those folks are doing the same. I heard a story.
yeah,
I knew a guy. There was
right,
this, right? There was only a couple of people that came close to having what we would call firsthand knowledge, but
right,
what they had firsthand knowledge of was not what they thought they had firsthand knowledge of.
right.
It turned out to be some other program that had nothing to do with aliens.
Yeah,
But it's advanced technology. It's part of the US's push for technological superiority, and they're not going to understand those things
right.
when they see them if they don't know what they're looking at.
Understood. And I just want to quickly, I think it looks like I was similarly perhaps intrigued and perhaps stunned by what Senator Rubio said on last June, in that News Nation interview. He gave a very long interview and he said some pretty remarkable. He praised the credibility of these individuals, I think, two or three times in language like this. And I feel like I'm probably beating a dead horse here with you, but is there some subset of it's you hinted at it, but could there be some subset of individuals that have not gone to AARO that are simply only going to Congress and the inspectors general?
So there is a small number of folks that still refuse to go to AARO,
Yeah,
but I have reviewed their testimonies and given my thoughts back to Congress on what is true and what is not true.
yeah.
Most all of it is not right.
Okay.
They got pieces of things right, but they're piecing together stories and information that are very, very similar to things that are out in the public domain with
Yeah.
maybe a name change or
Mhm.
location change or what have you.
Yeah.
There are some very small number of individuals who have gotten in trouble for what we call ticket collecting in the IC, where
Yeah.
they push to go get access to programs that they shouldn't have access to because it's not in their job jar.
Yeah.
And so
Is that
those
a
are the,
subtle, if I may interrupt, is that a subtle, perhaps, allusion or dig at David Grush, perhaps?
no,
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
just there's other people involved
Okay.
and some of them have um, gotten access to things, inadvertent access to things or sometimes intentional access to
Yeah.
things that they shouldn't,
Okay.
but they don't know what they're looking at.
Yep.
And when you put all of those things together, people draw conclusions that are erroneous.
Can I, I don't want to belabor this too much, but last but not least, Grush, I'm curious if you find him generally credible. He has stated in interviews, I think this was on Joe Rogan, he basically hinted at having spoken to what I interpreted as a president of the United States. He said, something along the lines of, I spoke to the highest of the high. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, he said he referred to agency directors. So that's
Yeah.
that's that. How do you interpret anything along those lines? And this is a
So,
statement that Grush put out
so
recently.
first of all, if I look at this statement, he shouldn't be aware of any of the primary interview subjects that came to us unless
Yeah,
they're talking.
right.
Now, I've spoken to the same agency directors that he claims he's spoken to.
Okay.
They've, they've told me what they've said. I understand exactly what happened
Yeah.
and why it happened. And I understand exactly why he and a couple of other individuals drew conclusions that they did,
Okay.
which have nothing to do with actual extraterrestrial programs.
Got it.
So they took statements from agency heads and directors and generals in ways that they were not intended. And
Yeah.
it is probably an internal bias for this is what I want to believe, and so this is what I'm hearing.
Got it.
But
Last but not
when you talk to those senior leaders and they have put it on paper,
yeah.
uh, that is not what they said.
So they have denied that in memos, in official memoranda. Is that
So
where you're
remember, everybody that comes to AARO, there was
right?
an interview process where they gave
Right.
a statement for the record, and that was put in. That forms the basis of what goes into the reports.
Got it. Got it. Excellent. Last. I promise this is the last on this topic. You mentioned in your Slack. It looks like this is a signal exchange with former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence Chris Mellon that the Department of Justice had Grush's
Yeah,
conversation.
I'm at the ICIG.
Oh, okay. So this is got it. Got it. Got it. So this is just an error. Got it.
This is where we get into one of these legal loopholes, right?
Yeah.
Um, Grush gave statements to the ICIG and to the DODIG.
Yeah.
Those fall under law enforcement
Correct.
authorities.
Correct.
Even though AARO has law enforcement authorities, because if somebody came in and made a claim about criminal activity, we could refer them directly to the proper law enforcement agency to take action on the criminal activity.
Right.
If they came in, so Grush had gone in to talk to those two ICIG and DODIG, and we had to get they couldn't just give me the statement because it's protected under law enforcement whistleblower protections. So we had to go through this long process of getting the relevant data pulled out and separate it from um, his complaint about wrongful prosecution or whatever.
Retaliation. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We had to separate the data, if he had any,
Yep.
from that. The data that was provided, we cross-referenced with what we'd already known because we had interviewed most of the people that he had already talked to, and there was nothing new. There
So
was nothing.
Arrow received port. If I just want to get this clear, Arrow received portions of Grush's ICIG complaint.
We got the portions that did not have to do with retaliation.
Got it. So okay, that's very helpful. Excellent. All right. Shall we move on to Gimbal? Anything else? Sorry, anything else that you wanted to add at this point on that element of this, whether it's related to legislation, the Hill, anything along those lines?
I mean, I want to be clear. The senators on the Hill are trying to do their job. They are, however, in many instances being, I would say, misinformed uh, by people who may have different motives than finding the actual truth. Um, I believe that we found answers to most every one of those allegations and provided that in a classified report up to Congress. Volume two will come out that will have additional information that was, that came after our cutoff date for volume one. And we'll have the same conclusions, have the same, I don't expect anything new out of that.
Got it.
Uh,
Excellent. Okay.
the only other thing I would touch on, and I wasn't paying attention to this too much because it seems to be a very mundane and trivial thing, but it speaks to motivations. I think a couple of months ago there was a hoopla from some group that was claiming my involvement in a meeting on the Hill back in
Oh, geez.
2018. I don't even remember the guy's
Skinwalker
name.
Ranch thing, right? Was that what
Yeah,
you're referring to?
yeah,
Yeah.
those guys, right?
Yeah.
And they were trying to make the claim that, hey, because I was involved with it way back when, you know, I clearly have some tie to all of this from wherever.
Hmm.
And even somebody even tried to make the claim that I was misleading the department, which, let's be clear, I was asked and told to go do this job. I didn't apply for it. So
All in told, which happens
I'm
at the
told,
Pentagon.
right? And that particular meeting, I was asked by some of those Senate staffers that are in
Yeah.
that picture to come be a objective third party, listen to what they have to say and give us your feedback,
Right.
which
Subject matter expert type of a thing,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, if one could claim subject matter expertise in this. So I went but so I think at the time, if I remember the time frame correctly, I was actually between assignments.
Yep.
I had been the senior S&TI officer for the Pentagon. I was going to Colorado to stand up Space Command. I think that was the time frame. Um, and I was asked to come take a listen and give thoughts. I did. I told them I thought it was not real. I thought they were doing pseudoscience and they weren't even really doing their science very well.
Yep.
And it was a publicity thing. I mean, there was a picture taken. I mean, I think there were several pictures taken. Um, and whoever the guy was, who I couldn't pick out if I saw him in a lineup, um, had nothing to offer.
Yeah.
But then later, a couple of months ago, tried to make this a thing.
Yeah.
And I think even went so far as to say that I had led the meeting, that I had said that this is something that we need to go jump on, and nothing could be further from the truth. That's such an embellishment of the circumstances. But
Yeah.
those are the same storylines of how these things come about, right? And it's just
Got it.
it's not you can't it's hard to combat misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy with anything other than science and education and fact. And you just have to keep beating on it until cooler heads prevail and critical thinking skills are reintroduced into the general population, which I'm concerned about.
Yeah, fair point. Speaking of science, I'd love to get to those three
Yeah,
videos and
let's jump
yeah.
on that.
Before we do that, I know people would love to hear this. To the extent that you can comment, and you mentioned that there were something, I think it was like 2 to 4% of the cases that you saw were anomalous, just on their face. Could you maybe provide, to the extent that you can, without getting into classified systems, but what was the most perplexing video or footage or anything sensor data that you saw during your time at AARO?
So I'll tell you the one, and I don't think it's been declassified yet, but it's in the queue to be declassified. These things take time. But there was an event, and I will just loosely describe it as what appears to be another, spherical ball, balloon. We'll call it a balloon, but a spherical ball. At the time, it looked like it was moving really fast, across. And it's another FLIR video. So all the best ones are FLIR videos, right? Because you can't see anything. So it's going really fast, and the recreation of the flight pattern seems to make it go, make a turn and come towards you, and it looks like it's speeding up, and the speeds look like to be, you know, initially it looked like it was around 1.5 Mach or something like that, and it was near a volcano,
Okay.
which is one of the biggest. Everybody loves the UAPs are attracted by volcanoes. And so, that one was on its face, that's anomalous, right? That looks weird.
Yeah.
And it had taken a year
Hmm.
to try to pull the data apart. Now, if people go onto the website, or if you remember some of my early testimonies, the way I had stood up the office we had, and the analytics was a scientific team and intelligence team, and they both look at the data, and then they kind of red team each other, and they come to a consensus, and then that gets peer reviewed, and then that comes to me as the director to sign out.
Right.
This one, the teams had gone back and forth for a year, because, and why? And this will get to these three videos. This is a very important point that most people, in fact, even many image scientists don't understand. When I'm looking at a two-dimensional video and I'm looking at an object, unless I have an unambiguous range to that object, or a reference point for that object, then any speed or altitude measurement you calculate is wrong.
Right.
Because
Absolutely.
you don't have the range data to
Absolutely.
right,
Yeah.
and that's where parallax comes
Right. Right.
in some sense, because there's also the optical illusion of you're going faster than it, or it's right.
Right.
But from a range perspective, the way you solve a parallax problem is you have to actually recreate the flight path of the camera that's taking the image, well,
That's
the
right.
platform that the camera is on, the
Right.
angle the camera is pointing at, and
That's
where
right.
the object is moving. But you have to recreate that for
Yes.
every layer of range, because you don't have range.
Right.
And then you have to match each one of those to what you see to figure out where in that range it most likely is. And every time we did that,
Yeah.
every time, including, I think it was the GoFast one,
Mhm.
it turns out to be that the most logical, the one that matches most to the data
Mhm.
is the object is moving very slow or moving with the wind, and the platform is moving faster and rotating, and so you're getting that parallax,
We
because there's
will
no frame of reference against the water, for
we
example.
will absolutely get to all of that. Any specific ones that stood out to you that were not resolved, Dr. Kirkpatrick? Anything that as the time you've left where you're like, wow, that's interesting, and we still don't know what
Yeah,
that is.
so let's be clear. If it's not resolved, it's either we didn't get to it yet,
Right.
or analysis is undergoing, or more data is required.
Yep.
There was nothing that was not resolved that I thought could absolutely be, what everybody's claiming it could.
Anomalous. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Anomalous to the point of extraterrestrial or advanced technology.
Got it. Okay. Without further ado, well, quickly, I know we're really tight on time here, so I will try to do this as expeditiously as possible. But let me switch over to this, and I don't know if you're familiar with Ryan Graves. He was a former F-18
Yeah.
fighter pilot. He recreated this. This is the situational awareness display as he remembers it. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is the gimbal object. This is on a the radar had it about 8 nautical miles at this point, give or take. This is a 20 nautical mile range, so that's this distance here. Gimbal's proceeding in one direction as he recalls it, and he viewed this tape several times in the debrief and the debrief room with the admiral present, and the Navy sent out an email, said, hey, this is happening in the middle of daily incursions. They, according to the aviators, were seeing these frequently. Then the object comes to a brief stop and then reverses direction without a radius of turn, while this quote unquote fleet of objects does this direction reversal with, they turn into the air like an airplane would. The gimbal object does this is a flat direction change, right? There's no lateral movement observed on the radar display. That's interesting. We won't go into it. So bottom line is what I worked with a colleague of mine, and also Mick West, who's a well-known skeptic, who he's created a 3D modeling system, and we created our own 3D models, but we used, to your point, the elevations. We have a 2-degree angle of depression. We look at the azimuth, and we can literally trace a flight path for these objects, for this object in 3D space. And to your point, the range is the key. But here's what's really interesting. When you account for wind, direction of wind, most critically, the F/A-18's flight path, and when you account for wind and how that deflects the flight path, we can find that trajectory that was seen on radar, that moving in a straight line and then immediately reversing direction. And that looks like, from an overhead view, that would, not to scale, but that would be something like this. So you see the F/A-18, and then you have the gimbal object doing that ping, right? It goes directly and reverses direction. And I hope this doesn't get too pixelated, but this is a lateral view of that flight path that can be found in the line of sight. I cannot stress enough that the odds of finding that line of sight in the data at the range provided by the aviators with high confidence is pretty remarkable. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because these are all direct quotes from Lieutenant Ryan Graves. But what's fascinating is the way this object rotates down to the second at the apex of that turn. And here it is right here. That long continuous rotation matches to the second at that range given by the aviators. That is from a math and science perspective, that's extraordinary. The odds of finding that highly anomalous track and also matching visually the rotation, this is another view of that, I find to be astounding. That's like a 1 in a trillion chance, right? So this rotation, that green line, is that reconstructed flight path at that roughly 6 nautical mile range. And that rotation in that animated on the left, that is not in any way fudged. That is the actual rotation of the object in the video. What do you think about that, Dr. Kirkpatrick? What are your
How
thoughts?
did you get the range?
Uh, I can give you that. That was from Lieutenant Graves. He stated with very high confidence. I can pull up the actual
So
quotes.
here's my problem with all of that.
Yeah,
A couple of things. One, it doesn't take into account the sensor and how the sensor works,
sure.
uh, and how it rotates as well.
It doesn't
Uh,
rotate in steps. I talked to the FLIR, the patent
we
holder,
have
and
we have we have the sensor. I'm
okay.
telling you,
Does it
the
rotate in
sensor
steps?
sensor works very much. Do you remember? Did you ever see? I'm sure you have Maverick.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
Top Gun, you mean? Yes.
no Maverick.
Okay. Yes.
If you saw Maverick, you saw how the laser sensor on the laser guided weapon rotates,
Sure, okay. On the
right?
bomb, you're talking about
No, no.
on the
So
ordnance,
it's a laser guided missile.
right?
Laser stays on the platform and it rotates to
Correct.
put a beam on there, and
Right.
then the beam rider missile follows the beam, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
A lot of these sensors, they do the same thing. All of the FLIR pods, all of the imaging sensors, because they rotate as the platform rotates. And so I would just be cautious about that. One, two,
Oh, can I
hang
just
on.
quickly add to
Yeah, yeah.
that? Okay. All right. So let me just quickly add to that. I've talked to just about every SME in the military and the private sector about this. So this is how. All right. Is this coming through for you? Can you see the video?
Yeah.
This is an actual recreation down to every detail that we can add. That's how the sensor would have rotated in the gimbal engagement. There's no need to introduce steps into that. That's just not how that system works. I'll play it again.
So I'm not saying there's steps. I'm saying that's how it rotates but when it rotates, the object would rotate.
Well, we've looked at, there's a lot of, first of all, the object rotates in four distinct rotations, right? They're choppy, they're disconnected.
Okay, but you don't have the raw data. You're using internet data. So anything that's choppy is from image compression. It has absolutely nothing to do with the raw data.
But I thought the rotation was because of the sensor was rotating.
The rotation is, but the steps that I think you're referring to
Yeah.
may not be real. That's what I'm getting at. So what I'm trying to get to is those videos that everybody is over analyzing until they're blue in the face is not raw data. And
Okay.
without raw data, you have image compressed data that's out on the internet. And image compression does all kinds of weird stuff, all kinds of weird stuff to videos.
Okay.
There's image compressions videos where you can see shadows of people after the people have gone by. There are image compressions of people where things, of objects where they get pixelated or they blur or they
Yeah.
jump because you've missed a frame because it's compressed.
Sure.
So unless you have the raw data, it is really hard to draw a conclusion about things that might look like optical effects.
Well, here's where, and this is where the rotation is so critical because there are and I hopefully this doesn't come through choppy, but the four distinct rotations in that video are noted in this video, and I highlight them. And the key is that third one. It's long and continuous, and it is down to the second a match with that reconstructed flight path. Here's one, all right? Here's two, and here comes the long continuous one. The odds of that matching the flight path, which matches what is seen on radar, which the aviators have extremely high confidence was at 6 to 8 nautical miles. That's extraordinary, right? You can't just
Well,
simply
I wouldn't say it's extraordinary because one, I don't have high confidence in what the aviators are saying because they don't have a laser lock on it. So
well,
if you know
they don't use
that,
the FLIR laser in midair. It's just not used in midair. That's a
they
flight safety hazard.
a lot of them have that data now. They didn't do it then. So they don't have laser ranging of these things. And if you didn't turn your laser ranger on, you have no unambiguous range. None.
Again, that's just not common. Aviators they're trained not to turn their laser on in air-to-air engagements.
But they are now because they've been told to.
Really? That's news. Okay. That's
I
actually
mean, that's
that's helpful to know.
part of some of the, driving training of some of the aviators when it comes to things like this is you got to turn all your sensors on. If you're
Okay.
seeing something, turn it all on and save it. They don't have unambiguous range. A pilot estimates range with his thumb and speed with his thumb, and you can't put any credibility into that. As much as I love our pilots and they're the best pilots in the world, when you're talking about trying to apply a guesstimate to something that somebody remembered from however many years or decades ago, um, in a scientific, rigorous, and technical evaluation, you're going to
Right.
come up with all kinds of interesting things.
Let me rephrase, I guess. The point is the data and the science from what we're seeing confirms the range data given by aviators. Let's put it that way. So
No,
we just
that's
plug
not
their
what it
data.
says. That's
We
not what it says. What it
okay.
says is you have a range of solutions to this flight path. One of those matches what people are wanting to believe. One of them also matches the most likely scenario.
Okay.
And so, which one are you going to pick? The one that everybody wants to believe, or the one that is more likely?
Well, and I'd be curious to know what the more likely scenario is here because we've looked at all the flight paths at distances up to, at 50 nautical miles, and we haven't found anything that looks plausible.
So, the most plausible thing is that it is a stationary object moving with the wind, and the rotation you're seeing is coming from the sensor rotation.
Again, the AT flare doesn't. Okay, so I'm sorry, you're confusing me. You're saying that the rotation is sensor art. Sorry, is compression artifact?
It's a sensor artifact from it rotating because a lot of that is glare that you're also getting off of the reflection. That's why it's so apparently hot because you have to now and do the sun angles off
This
of
is
that.
at night, first of all.
Okay, it was at night. That's right. This is the gimbal.
This
Oh,
happened 10
okay.
minutes after the GoFast video, 100, 200, 300 nautical miles off the coast of Florida, and there's no balloon trajectory. We looked at every single possible, there's no plausible within the lines of sight, right? Within the AT FLIR lines of sight, that's the elevation and the azimuth. There's no plausible balloon trajectory within the lines of sight.
But you don't have range. So I don't understand what you mean there's no trajectory in line of sight because there is one. It was recreated.
I
There is a way to do that where
I'd
you get.
love to see that analysis because I don't think even the likes of Mick West, who spent more time than anybody on this, has found a trajectory that finds this moving in the wind as a balloon 300 miles off the coast of Jacksonville.
Okay, well, I would
Okay,
have
well,
to
let's move on.
say
Let's move on.
with that.
I've got a lot more just briefly, quickly on GoFast.
Okay.
NASA did not account for wind. That's a massive scientific error. And when you account for wind, you get a speed. If you're assuming the range is correct and this object was at 13,000 feet, you get a speed that's closer to 100 knots, 120 miles an hour. That's a pretty stunning error on NASA's part, I think.
Well,
Planes don't fly in vacuums, right?
I haven't looked at NASA's analysis.
You have not looked at NASA's analysis. Okay. But is it fair? You get the point, right? That they admitted right there. This is directly from NASA's report. Our calculation has neglected wind effects. That's a pretty stunning error on their part. And to your point about range, we have used 3D recreations and matched the background. And this object was again happened 10 minutes prior to Gimbal at night, hundreds of miles off the shore, off the coast of Jacksonville. Pretty anomalous amid daily, FLIR and radar locks on these
I'm
objects.
not really sure I'd go that far. I
Okay.
really wouldn't. The number of objects, especially balloons, that are in the Jacksonville area or in the PAX area or over
Yeah.
CONUS at any
Yeah.
given time is
Right.
huge.
So you have two anomalous, seemingly anomalous objects at, let's say, 13 to 20,000 feet, 200, 300 miles off the coast.
Yeah, we get up. Do you know where those objects come from? They follow the jet stream.
Sure, and they go west to east. Yeah, I'm tracking.
I mean, we get them all the time.
Right. So,
But
and these guys were, yeah,
this is why pattern of life analysis is so important.
right.
Why you've got to have 24/7 coverage of these things all the time, of these areas all the time,
Yeah,
so you can count the number of stuff that comes through there. And
yeah,
when we've been looking, it's it's a lot. There are 10. I mean, when people say there are daily incursions, sure, there's crap in our airspace
yes,
all the time,
right,
all the
right,
time,
right.
right?
Yeah,
Finding out where it is and what it is what the challenge comes down to.
absolutely. And
But it,
this comes, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, but it always turns into slower moving objects than people think,
Right.
and not anything that's super exciting, to be honest.
Speaking of super exciting, are you familiar with these? These are hazard reports that were filed by, I believe these were by VFA 11 flying out of Oceana in 2014. And this is what spurred Lieutenant Graves to come forward because they were seeing objects on FLIR, CADM 9X, visually occasionally. and on radar that were stationary against direct quotes or hurricane force winds, right? And they have multi sensors, eyeballs on these objects on a daily basis. That's interesting to me. I don't know what to make of that. And then the
Okay, but
middle
is
case,
there any data? Was there any data submitted with that?
I fear not. I think
Right.
this is absolutely pre-Arrow. But
And
this
so
is
that, but
yeah,
this is what I'm getting at, right?
yeah,
The pilots see things and they're highly trained and very professional pilots, but they are still human and they are
right,
still subject to error and optical illusion.
right,
And so they're saying they saw something against hurricane force winds.
right.
How do we know that? What did
Well,
they save? What data do we have to analyze?
fair, fair.
Right? Without that, this is all the evidence you have.
I understand, but I'd like to think that when these guys are frustrated and the Navy, their commanders are calling this a critical and a severe risk, a severe threat to naval aviation.
I don't doubt and I do not disagree with their frustration with the bureaucracy within the
Yeah,
Navy, the Air Force, or the
yeah,
DoD at doing something.
right,
I absolutely understand that frustration, but you've got to separate that frustration from science and fact.
right,
So that is what led to, Congress telling us to go do something about it.
right,
So
right.
now they're doing something about it.
This reads to me like a range Fowler minus the data, right? So I've
Yeah,
got a radar track, stable radar track, and an Academ 9X, which for folks don't not tracking this, it's an infrared training missile, but it's an infrared sensor. So that means there's something there, right? So you have both a radar and infrared. They flew on, and they have the Gehemic system, right? The helmet mounted cueing system that allows them to place this visually in three-dimensional space. They fly up within 200 feet, see nothing visually. How do you get multi-sensor saying there's something there? Eyeballs say there's nothing there. That's interesting, right? And this is just not a one-off, right?
what was the time of day?
I don't have that at my fingertips.
Right.
Yeah,
So I'm going to guess that it was in low lighting conditions, whether it's evening, dusk, or night.
yeah,
Um, and because we get these often, because here's what happens. There's a couple of things that people, again, you don't know unless you go and do the science.
right,
The radars, the sensors have never been calibrated against balloons ever.
yeah,
Right. That was one of the things that we stood up AARO to go do was go calibrate all this stuff. And why is that important? Because a weather balloon is made of different material depending on the altitude at which it needs to go. Some of them have metal strips in them. Some of them are mylar. Some of them are not, and they're just latex. For those not familiar, mylar is a metal. It's like aluminum foil, but much thinner. And the metal strips are all of that gives spurious radar returns. Why is that important? Because the sensors are attached to machine learning AI and or just plain old advanced data analytics that estimates speed and range and whatnot based on those radar returns.
right,
If those radar returns are spurious or are missing,
right,
it calculates something that is nonsensical.
right,
And oftentimes that leads to, we've even had data where reports where they provided data and the data says, hey, this thing went from, half a Mach to 1 Mach.
right,
Okay, well, when you pull the raw data out and you look at the radar returns, it turns out that some of those radar returns are missing,
right,
or many of them are missing. And
right,
what that means is when it does its calculation and it displays it on the HUD, it
right.
says it went from 0.5 to 1.
Yeah,
Well, the only reason it did that is because it missed some of that and it's estimating where its next place should be,
yeah. Got
right?
it.
And so
Got it.
those are errors that are built into the system because the systems are not designed for slow moving
Yeah.
balloon like objects.
I can
right?
quickly, I just looked up that one report we looked at, and that was during the daytime. I'm trying to get it, it was at 12:47 p.m., so middle of the day, that
That's
particular report.
fine because a translucent balloon at whatever speed they're flying by, they're not going to see very well.
And, but you, presumably radar reflectors would, you could see that at 200 miles, 200 feet
If
a
the
second.
radar is seeing it, maybe. But if you're telling me that they're flying up to it and they optically can't see it, it's probably because it's translucent.
Okay.
That's
Um,
plain fact of it. It's not magical. It's just translucent. And you're flying
we're,
in a jet going really fast.
yep. We had two jets flying in trail, right? But anyway, that's,
Doesn't matter. Same
we're,
thing. If it's
we're,
translucent, you're not going to see it very well.
and I know we're over time. I got to ask
Yeah.
you at the NASA panel where you presented, you mentioned you you guys were AARO was tracking or getting reports of quote direct quote from you in the slide was metallic orbs. They've been seen all over the world,
Yep.
making very interesting apparent maneuvers. That's interesting.
Yep. Turns out most of them are all mylar balloons
Okay.
and not
Um,
really doing anything special because of optical illusion and parallax.
I only ask because in the reporting, the historical reporting, and this is a lot, I know, but when you look at on the right are all the roundups from the USG, silver spheres, metallic spheres flying against the wind and doing all kinds of seemingly anomalous movements are replete in the reporting. Let's just say.
Yeah.
Um, and so that raised, I think, some interest, right? Because this goes back to World War II, guys seeing aviators seeing identical objects, metallic looking spheres. So had to ask
Okay.
about that.
Do you
Anything
know?
else?
So there's
Yeah.
a declassified program. I forget what it's called, um, where metallic, mylar balloons, mylar spheres are launched into an area to test radar responses and aircraft responses.
Sure. China
What
Lake type stuff,
happens?
right? I mean, yeah.
I mean, no, I mean, a foreign country
Okay.
tosses a bunch of these things in the air to see what somebody's going to do and how well do they detect it? How well do they figure it out? Those kinds of things happen all the time
Yeah.
and have happened since World War II when we had
Yep.
radars,
Yep.
right?
Okay.
That's kind of how you do intelligence.
That's right. You gotta, well, Palladium, I think, is the famous agency example. All right. Last, I promise this is it. Last but not least,
You've been promising for 10 minutes.
I'm happy to cut it off here if we want to. But I did want to get to the so-called Tic Tac video. Do you have 2 minutes to talk about that?
All right, 2 minutes.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So if we do just a little, some very basic, is that full screen coming through?
Yep.
Some basic, no wizardry here, just some basic adjustments. You get something that looks something like a Tic Tac. Commander Fravor, Lieutenant Commander Dietrich both mentioned these low profile appendages, or they called them possibly looking like pitot tubes. I'm not going to belabor this, but we've done the same 3D analysis. Any aircraft that within those lines of sight, it's significantly constrained because in the Tic Tac video, you're looking 5, 6 degrees up, and they're already at 20,000 feet. So you're very constrained in terms of range of what's plausible and reasonable for an aircraft. And any aircraft that's flying in a remotely level um, attitude or trajectory profile would look like what you have on the left here. That's the line of sight from the F-18 that recorded the video. Clearly doesn't match what's on the right. We don't need to belabor this point, but it does rule out an aircraft unless it has we calculated a 13 or 14 degree angle of attack, which no plane would be doing for, a minute and a half or whatever, however long that was. So interesting. Far more interesting is thanks to McWest, he created this system or simulator where you can actually put different objects in and you can actually play around with the pixelation and the degradation of the data, and you can get a pretty darn good match with, damn it, that looks like a tic tac shaped object with the the appendages that the eyewitnesses recalled. Again, this is about an hour or so after Commander Fravor and the other air crews saw this at closer range, and you get another version of this here. Pretty darn good match when you put in 3D modeling a tic tac. And last but not least, we've gotten quite a bit of into the weeds. Don't need to dive into this too much, but the bottom line is the anti-air warfare coordinator, the radar operator, if you will, was very specific about the metrics of this object, or these objects flying at a very specific altitude, about 28,000 feet, tracking south at 100 knots. You can see that, you can find that in the data. So this is back to the range issue with Gimbal, right? You can find in the data what the eyewitnesses describe with generally high confidence. Your thoughts? I know that was quick and dirty, but we did account. I'm fortunate enough to work with a climate scientist, so we have really good high fidelity data on wind as well.
So I will go back to what I started with, which is you're using internet data. And without the raw data, and this is what I've told Congress, we don't have raw data, we don't have radar data, we don't have any of the data that is claimed to have been taken. The Navy does not have it. The Navy doesn't have a lot of data, and it's
Yeah.
not a conspiracy. It's just that it's very inefficient to keep data for longer than periods than it
Yeah.
needs to. So there's nothing really to analyze except that data, right?
In the FLIR video, right, right.
Which is not raw data. It's not the raw data. It doesn't have the pixel by pixel data from the frame. It's compressed. And any compression, unless you have the compression algorithm and you can uncompress it, even if you did uncompress it, you're going to introduce more errors, is subject to speculation. That's one.
Okay.
And it has a lot of, any compressed data will give you artifacts, right? And some of those artifacts look like some of these things. I can't say that those are artifacts. I can't say they're not. And unless you have the raw data, you're never going to get to that truth. The second thing is, I will go back to, you've got pilots, you have humans who are recalling from 20 years ago
Yeah.
what they have a high confidence of. I can't accept that in a scientific, rigorous
Well, well,
analysis.
right.
Um, you know, it's just not possible. Unless you have something that measures that range,
Yeah.
unless you have the radar data, then you're at best medium confidence. Uh, and
I would,
even then,
yeah,
you
yeah,
don't
yeah.
have a lot to go off of. So
Right.
you can overanalyze these videos until we're all dead, but we're never going to get an answer. And that is what I have told Congress. If you don't have the raw data, if you don't have the original data, you're not going to get an answer. It is too far back in history. There is nothing much to go on there. I will go back to, you know, the declassified program I just told you about. What makes you think we're the only ones doing that? And the second thing is, you do recall that this is a test range where people go and test things. And if I'm an adversary, I'm going to want to know what you're testing.
Right.
What are you doing? So this could be as simple as it was somebody else trying to spy on us or trying to measure what our responses were. But I can't say that the that there is any evidence to support what people remember the maneuverability or the speeds or the
Sure.
altitudes
Sure.
to be, because there are other solutions to that eigenvalue problem.
Right. Right.
So, we can debate this all day, but you're never going to get to the answer
No,
because
I
we
get
don't
it.
have the data.
I would just submit that the FLIR data and the azimuth and elevation angles are indeed data that we can and
That
should
is
exploit.
something. That
It's
is something.
absolutely, it's incredibly valuable because we can say that gimbal is not a balloon, right? We can say it's not in the lines of sight. It's just impossible for it to be moving, against the wind or with the wind or what have you.
I don't, I
Anyway,
don't, I don't know that we can say that, but we'll say that you have a piece of data with ASL data. That's what AARO has been working with NGA and the other image scientists across the community to unravel.
right,
And especially when we have the raw data and the meta file, the
right,
metadata that goes with it.
right. All that I will say, and I'll leave it at this, I promise, and I really want to thank you again for your time. You've been incredibly generous, is that given the limited data that we do have, the fact that we can find what aviators and radar operators have said in the data, and those are highly anomalous observations, is I think non-trivial, and we don't need to belabor that point. But thank you, Dr. Kirkpatrick, for your time. I truly appreciate it, and let's stay in touch.
All right. You have a good night.
Thank you, you as well.